the inaugurated Aesthetics Forum. So as Daisy said, this is part of a larger project in which the Rothko Chapel is a case study and a chapter in this book project. Has anyone been to it, Rothko Chapel in Texas? Okay, so I'll say a bit in just a minute to introduce it. The colors are actually coming out pretty well in the slideshow. But just a bit about the broader project first. Let me get the slideshow going. A common theme in the aesthetic theorizing of the 19th century that we see in Romanticism, but going through the 20th century as well to certain strands of modernism, is that art will somehow step in and play some of the roles of religion. And my current book project is thinking about this idea that's very influential, but also quite elusive, what actually it amounts to. And I think when we look into it further, we see there was kind of never one single party line about how art was supposed to play this role, but instead a variety of avenues that get explored that reflect different conceptions of what about religion art might try to capture and what religion's important core really is. So just a sense of the structure of the book project, it's mostly organized around artistic case studies in roughly chronological order. So thinking after the first chapter about art and metaphysics, in the case studies being Baudelaire, George Eliot, Wagner, Rilke, Virginia Woolf, and then finally Rothko. So this is the Rothko bit. Now, by way of introduction to the Rothko Chapel itself, it's in Houston, Texas. It's arranged in an octagonal structure with 14 canvases, which gives you an overview. Rothko described some of them as triptychs, using that traditional terminology from paintings in churches, giving you a sense of the site here, the chapel, and then there's this reflecting pool, which I'll show you a picture of in just a minute. The reflecting pool, which has Barnett Newman's broken obelisk in it. Chapel itself is very unassuming on the outside, no windows except for a skylight at the top, you can see there, and just a few benches inside, very peaceful, contemplative atmosphere. So just to kind of work you into the idea of the religious air of the Rothko Chapel, this is what the art historian and curator Peter Sels says about it. Like much of Rothko's work, these murals really seem to ask for a special place apart, a kind of sanctuary where they may perform what is essentially a sacramental function. Perhaps like medieval altarpieces, these murals can properly be seen only in an ambiance created in total keeping with their mood. Or similarly, this is Dominique de Menil, who was one of the funders of the Rothko Chapel, also an art historian. I won't read out the whole quotation, but she says, "We're cluttered with images and only abstract art can bring us to the threshold of the divine." So initially the plan was that Rothko would do this chapel for the Roman Catholic University of St. Thomas in Houston. There are various disagreements with them, and the Menils decided that they were going to support the chapel as an independent project, and that they arranged for it to have a particular site in this neighborhood, Montrose in Houston, and it opened in 1971, a year after Rothko's death. So he had all of the canvases ready to go. He committed suicide in 1970, and then the chapel opened in 1971. Now, just to give a sense of some of his points of inspiration, one point of inspiration he often cites is the Santa Maria Assunta in Torcello outside Venice, as well as right next door to it, Santa Fosca, which is an octagonal church, which you can see in the picture up there. And in the Santa Maria Assunta, Rothko said, "I want to create something of the effect of the tension between these two glorious mosaics." So this is the one in the apse with the Virgin and Child, extraordinary mosaic that this picture doesn't really do justice to, and then facing it, the Last Judgment here. Now, the idea for the chapel grew out of a kind of dissatisfaction with the way that his art was being received, the places for presentation of it. He had a project to create murals for the Seagram building in New York, and probably a number of you will have seen these because they're now in the Tate. Then there's a story about how they ended up in the Tate. Rothko was initially going to do them for this Tony restaurant, the Four Seasons restaurant in New York, but he went to eat there and thought, I just cannot have my works in this space. First, though, he said, I'm gonna, this is the quotation on the slide, I hope to paint something that will ruin the appetite of every son of a bitch who ever eats in that room. If the restaurant would refuse to put up my murals, that would be the ultimate compliment. But then finally he decided, I can't even do that. I can't even have this abrasive gesture. I just don't want the works in the restaurant at all. And that's how those works ended up in the Tate. Now, many of us will be familiar with the kind of classic Rothkos, the sort of squidgy rectangular shapes. The canvases that are in the Rothko chapel are mostly a solid field of color or mostly a solid field of color with a little band around the edge. So these are from about a decade before, and then he's moving toward even more of the this kind of solid field of color style. So that's one of the triptychs in the chapel. So why think about this philosophically? Well, reflection on Rothko's work throws up a number of interesting philosophical and art historical questions about abstraction, about expression, about thematic content, if there can be any thematic content in the kind of high modernist painting like Rothko's, and around the aesthetic experience of this sort of art. So these are the questions that I'm going to be taking on. Now, one of the puzzles here is that abstraction seems fundamentally crucial to the artistic project that Rothko took up. And, what could be more abstract than this? But on the other hand, Rothko denied that he was an abstractionist. So one of the questions is why? How do we make sense of that? And what indeed is abstraction in painting? How do we classify Rothko along these lines? Now, this is the famous exchange where he denies it. It's with the art critic Selden Rodman. Rothko says, I'm not an abstractionist. Rodman says, you're an abstractionist to me. You're a master of color harmonies and relationships on a monumental scale. Do you deny that, Rothko? I do. I'm not interested in relationships of color or form or anything else. Rodman, then what is it that you're expressing? Rothko, I'm interested in expressing the basic human emotions. Tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. But those are the basic human emotions, or indeed even emotions. Another matter, we'll come to that. And the people who, and the fact that lots of people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures shows that I communicate those basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. And if, as you say, you're moved only by the color relationships, then you miss the point. So we can't take Rothko as his word, of course, but I want to explore both the question of abstraction and also this question of expression to think about what he's up to with these works. So again, what could be more abstract, seemingly, than this? So now just trying to think about philosophically what abstraction is. I think most of us would say something like Kandinsky's color study, here, abstract. Or another extreme, Yves Klein, blue monochrome, abstract. Something completely different, not abstract. The Arnolfini portrait. This is figurative to the nth degree, extremely detailed. Now, what is abstraction in painting? How do we think about that philosophically? Well, one natural line is the kind of starting point. Abstractions don't depict anything. They don't pictorially represent anything. But that doesn't seem to be right. This is a point that goes back at least to Volheim, that abstract paintings can permit twofold awareness. So they can permit an awareness of the canvas as a thing before you, but also things that are seen in the canvas. So, for instance, shapes that are seen in the canvas. So, arguably anyway, even abstract works do depict or pictorially represent things. In the case of the Kandinsky here, or in the case of maybe even the case of the Yves Klein, blue monochrome, as a kind of limit case. We have pictorial representation, albeit just of one color. So arguably we have even in that extreme case pictorial representation. So okay, so how do we try to tease these apart? How do we try to say what abstraction is as opposed to the non-abstract, the figurative works? Well, here are two works to keep in mind. They're going to come back in just a minute when we look to theory of this. One, Malevich's suprematist painting. Two, Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jatte. So keep those two in mind. And now to Kendall Walton. So here's a suggestion from Kendall Walton in My Mises is Make-Believe. Walton says, figurative paintings point beyond themselves. Le Grand Jatte portrays people and objects distinct from the painting itself, fictitious ones perhaps, whereas suprematist painting merely depicts its own elements in a certain manner. Le Grand Jatte induces and prescribes imaginings about things external to the canvas. Suprematist painting calls merely for imaginative rearrangement of the marks on its surface. So there's one suggestion for how we differentiate abstract works from non-abstract works, from figurative works. Similar suggestion from Michael Newell, who says abstract paintings will allow us to recognize spatial relations between lines and shapes. So think about the Malevich there. But what we don't get is the perception of volumetric form. We don't get three-dimensional objects in space. Now, of course, abstraction, figuration, this is a sort of spectrum notion here. These are spectrum notions. So things like analytical cubism, Brock, somewhere on the spectrum. Here we can maybe recognize the shape of the glass on the table, the shape of the table, but this is on the spectrum of abstraction. Somewhat less abstract, but still verging toward it, something like Cézanne's Mont Saint-Victoire. But what do we make in particular of the suggestions that we've just considered from Walton and from Newell? Well, keep this in mind for a minute. Not a work that's going to go on the walls of MoMA, perhaps, but an example for philosophers to think about, Mondrian 3D. So I think that although there's some intuitive plausibility from Newell and Walton's suggestions here, some intuitive plausibility to the suggestions, they're on something important, but I don't think either of these accounts is right. Contra Newell, I think there can be three-dimensional abstractions. Take the Mondrian 3D example. And contra Walton, I think abstractions can point beyond themselves. They can point to, say, symbolic or to expressive content while still not being figurative. Now, Walton and Newell are picking up on an important art critical and art historical tradition. And that's a tradition that associates abstraction with flatness, with the flatness of the canvas. So this is something that's especially pronounced in Clement Greenberg's work, or similarly, the primacy of so-called opticality, another sort of theme you get from Greenberg or in Michael Fried. All of these views, I think, implicitly accept the idea that abstractionism is a kind of formalism. And that's what I want to press on, because that's what I think Rothko is actually trying to deny, that he wasn't up to the formalist project, and those had become so conflated that he denied he was an abstractionist, even though in a very evident sense, he is an abstractionist. But also, I'm going to try to regiment those terms. So even if they don't have really clear univocal meanings, I'm going to try to regiment them to try to explain this, how Rothko could be said to be an abstractionist, but not to be a formalist, and that we need to pull these things apart. Now, in asking what abstraction in painting is, I think Rothko is pretty much a paradigm case of what we mean by it, in that the chapel canvases don't have any recognizable figurative representations, just about as paradigm as you can get for abstraction. But if we're asking whether his work is formalist, we're instead asking a different kind of question, I think, which is more about how it should be understood and how it should be experienced. So is the aesthetic focus to be just on shape and color? The formalist is going to say, yes, that's what aesthetic attention should be trained on. Rothko, however, will say no. And I think that's why he's not a formalist. So I think he's denying the conflation of abstractionism and formalism, but expressing this in terms of denying that he's an abstractionist, somewhat unhelpfully. Okay, now what is formalism? What can we say about formalism? Well, let's start with some of the people who are thought to be the key champions of formalism. One, Clive Bell in the early 20th century, and another in the mid-19th century, thinking about philosophy of music, in particular, Edward Hunslick. So according to both of these, both of these thinkers, significant form should be the focus of aesthetic experience. The form somehow sets the faculties in motion, brings about an intrinsically valuable aesthetic experience. But they want to say art's not really about anything, or to the extent that it is about something or appears to be about something, that's not of real aesthetic significance. So Bell, for instance, is talking about figurative paintings in many cases that have representational content, depictive subject matter, but he thinks that's not of aesthetic significance. That's irrelevant. What we need is to focus on the significant form in the paintings. Now, Rothko is deeply opposed to this kind of approach. He says, this was in a letter to the New York Times, there's no such thing as a good painting about nothing. The subject is crucial, and only that subject matter is valid, which is timeless and tragic. Now, further pressing on this question of what is formalism, actually, I think Hunslick and Bell, when it comes down to it, aren't really even formalists. I think it's actually very hard to find someone who really is a formalist. This is something we can talk about more in the Q&A. I have maybe a dubious position about this, but I'm curious to hear what others think. The strict formalists, if they really take the view seriously, they tend to have a very limited account of why art's significant. And most of them aren't actually willing to do that. So they start to backpedal from the formalism. And I think Hunslick and Bell are characteristic backpedalers. So one way that Bell is often approached is you get this little excerpt of Bell in some aesthetics anthology, and then it kind of looks like a formalist. But then if you actually read the whole book, art to the end, doesn't look very formalist anymore, or at least not what it looked like in that first chapter. Because with both Bell and with Hunslick, they say that art is somehow getting us in touch with ultimate metaphysics. And you think, what? That's your formalist view? So the formalism in the case of these two supposedly paradigm formalists, I think is a kind of false advertising. But maybe that's just a matter of semantics. But in any event, let's just have this on the table as some idea of strict formalism, whether or not Hunslick or Bell were actually fully card-carrying strict formalists in this sense. Now, another historically important view, important in particular for thinking about Rothko, is what we might call modernist formalism. So this is in particular associated with Clement Greenberg and thinking about modernism, high modernism as a phenomenon in painting. Now, this in a way is taking its cue from the strict formalist conception of aesthetic experience. So saying that this work is somehow setting the faculties into motion, giving us a valuable experience, but they're adding to this, Greenberg is adding to this, that it's going to occasion a reflection on art itself. That's one of the key Greenbergian themes, that modern art has this self-critical capacity, indeed even compares it to the Kantian critiques. Whereas the strict formalist, putting aside the exegetical questions about Bell and Hunslick, the strict formalist would say art isn't about anything. The modernist formalist will say it's about itself. Art is about itself. It's not about the external, extra artistic world, but it is about itself, occasioning reflection on its own medium, for instance. So that's a typically Greenbergian line, exploring the flatness of the medium, acting as a self-critique of the form, or what have you. So whereas abstraction has to do roughly speaking, with the descriptive issue, the extent to which there's figurative depiction. And of course, a lot of difficulty figuring out how do we separate the abstract from the figurative, but that's basically the issue that when it comes to abstraction. Formalism, on the other hand, I think is a normative theory. So formalism is making claims about what aesthetic experience should be like, namely focused on form, and where art's significance or its value lies, namely in the experience of form, or the reflection on form, or through form reflection on the nature of art. Now, however implausible formalism is as a theory of art and aesthetic experience as such, it's often thought, well, it at least works well for modernist painting, things like Rothko, Barnett Newman, what have you, Kandinsky. Modernist formalism, that's of course tailored in particular to thinking about pictorial modernism and trying to explain its art historical significance, trying to give an account of why it's valuable. But I think actually neither type of formalism really does justice to Rothko's endeavor, or to the endeavor of what we might call the more spiritual of the modernists. People like Mondrian, Malevich, Kandinsky, Newman, who have this kind of metaphysical religious talk that never really fit neatly in Greenberg's narrative. So that kind of stuff is just, it's off message from what Greenberg wanted, that we're exploring the flatness of the medium. You know, they're talking about getting in touch with the infinite and the transcendent, and that's not what he wants in his narrative. So that gets downplayed in the narrative of modernism that he's telling. Now, I think Rothko is reacting against this trend. And that's why Rothko says he's not an abstractionist, because abstractionism and formalism had become so conflated, abstractionism and modernist formalism in particular, in the critical discourse at the time. But I think it's actually crucial to understanding what Rothko is up to, that in another sense, if not quite the one his own, he was definitely an abstractionist. And that's very important to understanding his project. As is his understanding his rejection of formalism. And it's important, I think, for understanding the broadly speaking religious aspirations of the project too. So think back to that quotation we started with from Dominique de Menil. She says, in our present historical conditions, religious experience that's coming through art is best occasioned not through figurative representations, but through what Pache Rothko we might call abstraction. Now, importantly, though, that abstraction is supposed to be highly expressive. So it's not just a contemplation of formal elements or an exploration of art's own medium. It's supposed to be highly expressive, to be pointing to something beyond just what's on the canvas. All right, so now turning to think about expression and think about context in abstract art. So in addition to the abstractionist category, which he resisted, Rothko sometimes put in the expressionist category, and both of those at once often, the mid-century banner abstract expressionism. Now, there are ways of thinking about expressionism where it's congruent with formalism in the senses that we've outlined so far. So you might think of the focus is just on the expressive activity of the artist that leads to certain forms on the canvas, and then we just focus on those forms that are on the canvas as the appreciators. You might try to render the two consistent in that way. But for Rothko, subject matter is crucial. So this is why we're thinking about both expression and content at once. And the question for us now is, how, if at all, might there be any subject matter of this sort? How could these paintings be about something apart from, just being about themselves or about art history? Do they deal in profound themes of humanistic concern in the way that Rothko appears to think? Well, the formalist would say no, or at least even if they did, that wouldn't be the proper focus of aesthetic attention. But Rothko, I think, wants to deny that. And when he's denying that he's an abstractionist, as I said, really, I think he's denying that he's a formalist. But what might the paintings have that make them something other than just formalist? So I wanted to think about that, how we might theorize that. Well, on that question, there are, broadly speaking, two lines of response here. So one sort of a route is a kind of expression route, and the other route is a symbolism route. And possibly you might want to do some combination of these two routes. Okay, now according to the expression route, Rothko's works are expressive of emotional or other states. And if we look back at that quotation of his, that seems to be how he's thinking about it. And then they're expressive in such a way that that becomes their subject matter. So we'll have that in view. Another possibility is what we might call the symbolism route. So that's the thought that Rothko's works have a kind of symbolic content, even if they don't have any ordinary depictive content, even if there aren't recognizable objects from the everyday world depicted on the canvas. So with both of those routes, the expression route and the symbolism route, the paintings would go beyond just form, they would go beyond just inviting aesthetic appreciation of form, and would go beyond simply art concerned with reflecting on or commenting on itself. So these would be ways of trying to get beyond that. So let's now think about expression. Now, often when we think about expression in aesthetic context, it's bound up with the emotions, and that seems to be how Rothko is thinking about it in that one quotation that we looked at. That could be emotions that are expressed by the artist. It could be emotions that are evoked in the audience. It could be some combination of those two things. There's a kind of the kind of classic theory, the old theory, is that there's some combination of those two elements. So the artist is expressing certain emotions, and then the audience, in appreciating the work, comes to feel the emotions that the artist felt in creating it. And Rothko perhaps seems to accept some version of that view. So when he says, the people who are weeping before my pictures are having the same religious experience that I had when I created them, it seems to be a version of that view, that he expresses this religious experience in the works. He evokes that through the paintings in the audience, and then they come to feel that themselves. So that's a popular sort of view. Despite the popularity of that sort of view, there are often thought to be serious limitations with it, serious philosophical limitations, which may be familiar to worked on these topics before, read in this literature. There's a lot more literature in the philosophy of music on this. There's a little bit in painting, philosophy of painting. But one of the familiar points is that an artist needn't be feeling a particular emotion themselves in order to successfully express that in the work. And similarly, an audience needn't feel an emotion themselves in order to recognize the presence of that emotion in the work. So you could have a critic who doesn't feel the particular emotion, but nonetheless recognizes the expressive quality that's present in the works. So there are familiar sort of objections to these views. Artists like to express views like this. Rothko is representative of that, but there's some reasons potentially to be doubtful of these works. So even if we think his works are expressive, we needn't think they're expressive in just the way that he thought they were. We can potentially take the expressive view in a somewhat different direction from the what I'm describing as the classic theory here. So an alternative sort of view would locate expressivity as a feature of the artwork itself. They would say the expressive properties are things that can be identified in the painting or present in the painting independently of their particular genesis, whether it was in the genesis comes from the artist's own emotional states, and also independently of what is evoked in the person who recognizes them. Now, it could be that the person recognizes these features in the work and then comes to have an emotional response based on them or something like that. But it's severing the tight connection that was present in the classic theory, this sort of alternative view. Another important point to make, perhaps, is that expression, though it's often talked about in terms of emotions, needn't be limited to emotions in particular. I think it's an unfortunate feature of a lot of the literature on expression that it's focuses on the case of emotion as the a sole case of expression, but potentially other things could be expressed as well. You could express fragility, for instance, or other kinds of states or conditions that aren't necessarily emotions themselves. And indeed, I mean, what would it be for Rothko's works to be expressive of tragedy, ecstasy, and doom, to use his examples here? And what could they be expressive of those states? I mean, indeed, are those even emotions properly described as emotions? Seems maybe only in the case of ecstasy. Is that right? A further question that comes up here is, what would underwrite the determinacy of the expression? Even if we go that alternative route, what makes it the case that it's actually expressing this as opposed to this? That it's actually expressing tragedy as opposed to, say, triumph? How do we get any kind of determinacy? So even if we allow that Rothko's works go beyond the formal features, how could it be that they're expressing anything determinate? How are they expressing tragedy instead of triumph or what have you, let alone how do they have anything that could be described as a subject matter? So we can agree the mature work of Rothko doesn't have any pictorial content in the sense that there are no particular determinate scenes or figures that this work is depicting. But it's important to bear in mind here, though, that even in works that do have figurative depiction, clear figurative depiction, there's as in the case of religious or mythological paintings, there's often a whole layer of content in addition to that that's not itself pictorially depicted. So the content could be something that is symbolically presented, even if it's not itself pictorially depicted. So, for instance, here, paintings can symbolize abstract ideas. For instance, fidelity. So back to our example of the Arnolfini portrait, the dog symbolizing fidelity. But it's not, as it were, pictorially depicting fidelity. It's pictorially depicting a dog. And then the dog, through a kind of symbolic register, is standing for fidelity. So why, then, would symbolization need to run through particular things that are pictorially depicted? I think that's one question for us to think about here. So if we can symbolize mortality with a fly, another sort of convention in Western art, this is from Dürer here, symbolize mortality with a fly, why not with an abstract canvas? Why would it, so it could be doubtful that the dog or the fly successfully symbolize fidelity or mortality respectively, but that seems a pretty hard line to tread, actually. Now, so then what's the principled reason for drawing the distinction with abstract works? There are various things we can say here, but is there really a world of difference between these things? So even if Rothko doesn't have figurative content, even if there are dogs, no flies, there might still be symbolic content in the work. So this is one possibility for us to think about as well. But still, we're back to the indeterminacy issue, because there are much more established conventions. Dogs with fidelity, flies with mortality, much more established conventions in Western art history. Panofsky, others very interested in cataloging this sort of thing. So once you're aware of the relevant conventions, so this is the symbol for this particular saint, so you know what saint's being depicted, then you're positioned to know what's being symbolized, or if you know this about dogs and fidelity or flies with mortality, this clues you in to what's being symbolized in the painting. With Rothko, though, and with other works of pictorial abstraction, matters are much less clear. Still, though, it's not without important allusions to, for instance, traditions of religious architecture and iconography. So we have the octagonal shape of the chapel itself, a bit of blend of Eastern influences and Western influences, harking to the Santa Fosca that we saw a picture of, and various other octagonal chapel structures. There are the 14 canvases, which call to mind the 14 Stations of the Cross. Barnett Newman, in fact, has a work of 14 Stations of the Cross that's in the National Gallery in Washington. The triptych format, of course, reminiscent of the presentation of paintings in Christian churches, particularly at the altar, and various other things as well that clue one into its context. But still, there are grounds for puzzlement here. How could you successfully retrieve anything of this symbolic kind from the works? I mean, it's not the kind of allegorical one-for-one symbolism that's familiar from the iconographic tradition of Western art. It's not like the dog and fidelity, the fly and mortality, not quite like that. Well, from one perspective, it can seem like the open-endedness is a symptom of a potential cognitive bankruptcy. So, we might have a kind of emperor's new clothes worry. Is there really anything here? This sort of thing when it comes to alleged content or subject matter. If we can't say what it is that it's expressing, can it really be expressing anything, let alone anything that is of any significance? But I think that seeming flaw could also be thought to be a merit. And I think this is important for thinking about the religious dimension, religious very broadly speaking, dimension of Rothko's project. And that's because he wants to leave this indeterminate on purpose. He wants to leave this indeterminate. He wants to leave this open-ended. The works are, I think, artistically triumphant precisely because they're non-specific, precisely because of that abstract non-specificity, that we can't pinpoint some particular thing that's being symbolized, as it's sort of gesturing broadly at the transcendent, at the infinite, at maybe tragedy and doom, but we can't really pinpoint exactly what. Now, whereas more conventional religious traditions would more often give a specific interpretation of the transcendent, Rothko wants to leave that open, wants to leave open what the subject matter itself is, only to kind of to sketch it in the very broadest outlines, or point to it in the very broadest outlines. And I think this thought is captured very well by Robert Rosenblum in his book, Modern Painting in the Northern Romantic Tradition, where he says, it's as if the entire content of Western religious art were finally devoid of its narrative complexities and corporeal imagery, leaving us with these dark, compelling presences that pose an ultimate choice between everything and nothing. But the very fact that they create their own hierarchy of mood, shape, and sequence, of uniqueness and duplication, of increasingly dark and somber variations of plum, maroon, and black, suggests the presence here of some new religious ritual of indefinable yet universal dimensions. And in our secularized world, inherited from the Romantics, a world where Orthodox religious ritual was so unsatisfying to so many, the very lack of overt religious content here may make Rothko's surrogate icons and altarpieces experienced in a non-denominational chapel all the more potent in their evocation of the transcendental. So I think Rosenblum is really onto something there. And of course, the title of the book is bringing together the Northern Romantic tradition and modernist painting, and Rothko in particular. So, think about this. This is the North Apse triptych of the Rothko Chapel, and compare it with this. This is Caspar David Friedrich's Seacoast in Moonlight. Here, yes, there are things that are, we can see a figurative scene. We can see a seacoast, and we can see the ship out there and the rocks and the moonlight and the clouds and so on. But the work is expressing something that's beyond any of those particular things that are pictorially depicted. It's somehow expressing or evoking the idea of the transcendent. We could give them more specific interpretations, maybe, but we can sort of gesturing broadly in this sphere of the transcendent, maybe something about the solitude of human existence, something in this vicinity. And I think it's works like, among other things, works like this that Rothko has in mind and is just abstracting even further from. So this from this. So on the reading that I'm presenting following Rosenblum, Rothko is making a virtue of the non-specificity. So in one sense, we might think, actually, Rothko is just doing what religious art has been doing all along. He is using the visible to point to something that can't be adequately expressed in a visible way. So on the reading that I'm suggesting, though, what Rothko is doing is foregrounding that very inadequacy in a way that that inadequacy is not usually foregrounded in other religious works. So more conventional religious iconography will, for instance, depict God as a bearded man and the Holy Spirit as a dove. So here is Libera. God as a bearded man, the Holy Spirit as a dove. Now, Rothko, by the very non-specificity here, by the absence of a clear referential scheme, is not going in for that route. But it's not as if we think, Ribera thought God had a beard, or thought that the Holy Spirit was a bird. It's instead that those are themselves meant to point to something that can't really be captured fully in a visual way. But Rothko's just making that even more apparent, that the things that he's trying to capture can't be adequately presented in a visual way, or at least in the form of something that's pictorially depicted visually. And I think that non-specificity is essential to the kind of aesthetic religious experience that Rothko wants to afford. And it's why I think it's important that we continue to see him as an abstractionist, despite his resistance to that label itself. It's very important to what he's doing that he is abstracting. He is going from something like this to something like this, and thinking about the transcendent, not in these kinds of terms, but in these kinds of terms. So, now, another important thing to bear in mind here is that art is not necessarily trying to be a replacement for religion in Rothko's case. In some of the other examples that I'm thinking about in this broader study, art is trying to be a replacement for religion, trying to step in and do some things that religion did, but leave some other bits behind. In Rothko's case, though, through its very generality, it aims to reach across the believers, the non-believers, across different religious traditions, and try to capture some kind of core that they share, some kind of common syncretistic core that can be found here. And indeed, even those who subscribe to doctrinal religion, so Dominique de Menil, one of the funders of the Rothko Chapel, was a devout Catholic, can find in these works the evocation of the transcendent in a way that's consonant with their own religious beliefs. So it might be thought, indeed, as it is by Menil, that works like Rothko's actually have advantages over more conventional religious depictions of the subject matter. Because as we saw with the Vivera example, in these cases, we're still getting symbols or metaphors of a kind anyway. We're getting God as a bearded man, we're getting the Holy Spirit as a dove. And what Rothko's doing is trying to get those notions of the transcendent, but indicate to us that they can't be captured in a mode of pictorial depiction, that, and through the very non-specificity of the work, trying to underscore that. So we might think that Rothko's work better or at least equally has the capacity to express the divine or the transcendent and the associated kinds of emotions or conditions compared with works of a more conventional religious subject matter, compared with, again, something like the Barrow. So then a final question here before I draw to a close. How could this be a religious experience? Rothko says the people who weep before my paintings are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. How is this a religious experience? How is it a religious experience for people who don't subscribe to any sort of theological outlook? How does that make sense? And that looked to be the category that Rothko himself belonged to. So Rothko seemingly is an atheist, a little bit hard to pin down, but seemingly is an atheist. Now, of course, people like Dominique de Menil can think, well, this is evoking the transcendent God of Christianity, but that doesn't seem to be Rothko's view, and that doesn't seem to be his expectation for audiences, that that's what they're thinking. This is evoking this the transcendent God of Christianity. So why think that that term, religion, the one that Rothko, religious, that Rothko uses, why think that makes sense to talk in these terms? Well, we can at least say, if we don't want to put too much weight on the religious itself, that at least the work is quasi-religious in having some important similarities with the character of religious experience. So what he's inviting is an experience that is solemn. He's inviting an experience that's contemplative, experience that's profound, an experience that is mysterious in certain ways. And that has affinities with common conception of religious experience. So we might just say, well, we won't really fight about the term religious, we'll just say it's quasi-religious. Now, putting that issue aside, many just don't want to have that experience that Rothko wanted to evoke. Basically, like, yeah, no, thank you. I don't want to be thinking about the transcendent, even if it's not the Judeo-Christian God. I don't want to be thinking about tragedy, ecstasy, and doom in this place. I just really like these forms and these colors, and I want to sit and contemplate them. Well, fine. That's what you want to do. And I think many are put off by the kind of religious talk of people like Rothko and Newman and Kandinsky and others, and want to take a more formalist approach for that reason. And of course, you can have aesthetically rewarding and valuable experiences of Rothko's works at the chapel by doing that. But I think if you do, you're missing what Rothko thought was the most important dimension of what he was trying to do. Maybe you're missing that for the better, maybe you're missing that for the worse, but that would be the point I would close on. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew. We're going to break slight vision and just have a 2